Hey guys, it's Strelper here. I'm gonna start talking about kind of part two to third-party gaming. My first video, I made it really quick. Honestly, the first one I did was like 30, 40 minutes long about how I got into video games, but I just felt like it wouldn't keep anyone's attention. I don't think it was very intriguing, maybe. But anyways, I'm going to try to keep this brief and just keep it to some interesting stories on how I started in product development for video game accessories. So at the end of my last video, I was talking about how I had just got a job with a company called Electrosource out in Vernon, California. And they were a software distributor. So NES, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 GameCube, basically all the games, we were distributing them and selling them to major retailers as well as companies like Microplay and Gameforce, kind of smaller franchise gaming retail stores, electronics boutique, things like that. Anyways, I was doing sales for software distribution there for, a couple years. And at that time, there really wasn't third-party video game accessories. There was like one or two companies. There was a company called Interact. There was a company called Naki. Mad Cats was making steering wheels at the time. And our customers would always ask us for video game accessories, like, besides software, can I buy like an RF switch or a S-video cable? And there weren't really many options for us to purchase from. So, every now and then we might buy some products from Naki or Interact, right? But one day, we thought like, hey, what if we were to make our own accessories? That could be pretty cool. Anyways, at that time, like I said, I went from being a cook. I did a ton of telemarketing and sales, always a hardcore gamer, but then, I was selling video game software. So I was going to school for computer graphics and graphic design. So I had, some design background, but I didn't know anything about product development. But anyways, what started happening was coworkers, people above me were coming to me, as the only true gamer in the company, asking me for product ideas. Like, what should we make? What should we do? What would a gamer want? And I fed a few ideas of what I thought would be cool. And this went on for a while, and it was taking away from my sales, and the majority of my sales were, I was making money off commission. So eventually I just said, look, I can't do both. I can't like have a full-time job doing sales and then be coming up with these product ideas. It's just taking away my time of selling. Anyways, they then approached me and said, well, hey, what if we created a role for you, product developer, and that was your full-time job, was not only coming up with the product ideas, but overseeing the production, spending time in overseas at the factories, um, helping design the product, making sure that firmware was working properly, the controllers were functioning properly, a lot of testing and things like that. And clearly I thought that was awesome. So I immediately said yes. And, that's kind of one of the first roles of product development in third-party gaming. And around this time, we were giving the exclusivity on a game called Chameleon Twist, meaning we would be the exclusive distributor for this title for Nintendo 64. And it's funny because I'll never forget when that game came in and we had the opportunity to publish it. I was young, right? I wasn't the most mature person at that time, and one of the higher level executives had me take that game home. I played it for a while. I came back in, and the next day he came in and he's like, well, Jason, what do you think of this game? And my answer, I'll never forget, was, it sucks, right? And nobody in the room liked it, especially the guy who asked me the question. Like, it just was too blunt. Like, what do you mean it sucks? And Then I went into detail. I mean, my gosh, after playing games like Mario 64 and GoldenEye and Jet Force Gemini and all these AAA titles from Nintendo, Chameleon Twist just, I went into more detail why I didn't think it was such a great game. And it's funny how valuable that game is today. I mean, I remember we couldn't give that game away back in the day. That was one of the games that we'd tell people, like, if you want copies of GoldenEye, you're buying 6 copies of Chameleon Twist. But anyways, it wasn't a big success. Anyways, eventually it came down to making product. And I'm going to share some screenshots of some of the first products that I made at Pelican Accessories. So, some of the images I just showed were literally the first products I ever developed. And there was nothing super fancy there, mostly switches and cables and GameBoy kits and things like that. But then it was time to start developing, true licensed products. So the goal was to get the license from Microsoft to make a certified controller for Xbox. And before I get to the Xbox One controller, I mean, there were unlicensed controllers that I had developed at that time, Super Nintendo controllers. I think we did an NES controller, wireless pair of NES controllers that were using infrared, and things like that. But when it came to Xbox, we ended up securing the license from Microsoft. And at that time, the Duke controller was the only thing on the market. I think we all agree it was too big of a controller. So I wanted to, we didn't really go down all the way to like the size of the S controller, but I definitely wanted to make our controller a little smaller, a little more ergonomic, and have some cool features in it. So came up with the Trick controller. And one of the really cool features in this is, I remember games like Tekken and Street Fighter and any of the games that had really intense combos. Having a program button on your controller was something that was starting to come out, and people were talking about it a lot, which really required you to quickly do the combination on the controller and it would record it, and then later in the game you could just push a single button and it would do, throw a fireball or do a complex Mortal Kombat move or something, as an example. But I wanted to go above that and do something even more complex, and I wanted to be able to record that program feature while in gameplay. So real-time recording, so I can make sure I properly did the move, because I saw Ken throw an uppercut, or I saw him throw a fireball, or just examples. Like I said, normal programmable controllers, you would do that when you're not in the game. So with our controller, I could be in the game, hit record, and it's just recording in the background. And then once I successfully did that move, I could hit save. And now I know that combo is properly saved. Anyways, that was kind of the story behind the Trick controller. And I wanted this big X kind of across the front to symbolize Xbox. And like I said, I was doing graphic design back in the day. And I came up with this logo, which clearly is not very good, but you can see where I got some inspiration on this, if any Metallica fans out there. But yeah, just look at the M and the A in Metallica, and you can see where that came from. So really successful controller for us. You can see it's got the Xbox certification logo there. And once we had that Xbox logo, we were doing all kinds of Xbox licensed products. And PlayStation 2 was a big deal back then, obviously. And we didn't have the Sony license at the time, but we were still able to make some cool products that were unlicensed. This is one here. This is the RetroShock controller. There's not much I can do about my dogs barking in the background. Anyways, this was a Retro 2 controller for PlayStation 2. back then I was still a big fan of the Sega Dreamcast, and I'm like, you know what if we put an adapter in this so you could use this controller on the Sega Dreamcast? And I actually did the graphic design for this label, and it's funny when I look back at this stuff how just bad it was, but I don't know, I was using like Quark Express and was just started school for graphic design, so it was the best I could do. But anyways, yeah, it was a cool controller. Did really well, wired controller. And then, as you know, one of the biggest selling points of the PlayStation 2, on top of it having amazing games, was the DVD functionality. So we created a DVD remote, and that is here. I have another video that I uploaded just talking about a funny story behind this. I'm not going to go into it again, but you should check it out. It's pretty funny. And then we moved to RF wireless, and this was the Freedom Shock 2. Again, I've got a video up on a funny ad we did for this product, but I think my best memory of this controller that I will absolutely never forget is, keep in mind, PlayStation 2 launched, it shipped with wired controllers. There was no wireless controllers for the PlayStation 2 right at the beginning. So we wanted to have one of the first, if not the first, true wireless controller for PlayStation 2 that also supported the pressure-sensitive buttons that it had that were new to PlayStation 2. Anyways, at a meeting at a major retailer at Best Buy, and I was in the room pitching the product and all the functionalities of it, and I got up out of my chair with the controller. We had a TV in the room with, a game playing. I forgot what game it was. And I said, "Can I leave the room?" I got up, I went 2 rooms away, and they had these windows there so I could kind of see what I was doing still, and continued to play the game. And it was like one of the first times, where the buyer saw a controller working through walls. Because prior to this, I mean, most controllers were IR, infrared, line of sight, Once there's anything in the way, the controller disconnects. But this was such a big selling point, standing in another room and still controlling the game. I mean, it's just, even when I bump into that buyer, now 20 years later almost, it's a funny story we always talk about. Like, I'll never forget that time you were playing a game in a different room. But yeah, just an awesome story. So this was a cool product for us. And I, again, I've made a couple of videos of these products individually where I talk about some funny stories behind them. So you might want to check that out as well. And then during this time, all the consoles were hot. I mean, I was making products for Game Boy Color, Game Boy, PlayStation 2, obviously, PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, GameCube, Dreamcast, all the big consoles. Obviously, we're attending all of the E3 shows. E3, actually, back in the day, was in Georgia, which was kind of, living in LA, it's like, man, we had to ship all of our product to Georgia, set up this big booth. But yeah, I've been to pretty much every E3, all the CES shows. There was a lot of video game trade shows back in the day that, we'd have a big booth, and I'd be there to talk about the products and demo the products. And I'll throw an image up of the first booth that we ever had for Pelican Accessories. It's pretty funny. And then, as I had mentioned, there was another company called Mad Catz, and back then, their big products were steering wheels, and then they had a cheat device called Game Shark, and we had a competing product called Codebreaker, which was also a form of a cheat device. Did pretty much the same thing, and that was a fun project to work on. And with Nintendo 64, we actually launched a really cool product called the Tilt Pack, which, I want to say it's like one of the first ways of using motion on a gamepad. It was for Nintendo 64. It looked like a rumble pack. You put it into the bottom of the Nintendo 64, and as you moved it, the character or the car or the plane on the screen would move. And I remember always demoing that with Star Fox 64, and people were just blown away. That was actually a really, really cool product. Another major project that I developed at Pelican Accessories was, as a gamer working in the gaming industry, obviously I got all the consoles. And, back then you could have one console hooked up to your TV. So the idea of the system selector came up, which I'm going to show a couple of the ones I developed on the screen here. And yeah, it started with an RF system selector, and then, it was like, okay, well, let's do RF, AV, and S video. And as technology improved, the idea was to create a really large system selector that was the same size of kind of your components under your TV, or your stereo components, your VCR, and it had component S video, AV, and RF all in one. You could hook up like 5 or 6 consoles to one TV. We had little nameplates that had every console name on it that you could switch out for, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that was really cool. And then I remember Mad Catz launched a controller called the Lumicon, and it had the symbols on the 4 main action buttons lit up. And I'm like, that is cool. I was a little envious of that. It's like, how do we one up that? So started looking at some LED technologies, and came across EL wire, which, let's see. You can kind of see it lighting up a little bit, except for my screen's kind of bright in front of me, but let's see. So you can see this wire lights up. It's called EL wire, which stands for electroluminescent wire. And it was like, what if we took this wire and wrapped it around the edge of the controller? And how cool would that look? And we made some prototypes. It absolutely looked amazing. We did a polycarbonate housing, put the EL wire around it, pulled power from the system to light it up. And, at that time I was pretty much coming up with all of our product names. I threw out the name, After Dark, which I thought was a cool name. Then I, threw out the idea Afterglow. And around this time, there weren't a ton of video game controllers on the market. And I think their main competitor at that time was the Lumicon from Mad Catz. We ended up going with the name Afterglow. I'm sure some of you gamers out there have heard or seen the Afterglow controller. But yeah, that, was, I want to say, the majority of that development, a lot of that development was done in my garage, playing around with this EL wire. So yeah, that's kind of a quick story of getting into product development and starting to work with licensors, like Xbox, and eventually Sony, Nintendo. And after Pelican Accessories, I moved to a company called Mad Catz, which I'll talk about in my next video. And I'm going to be just putting up a lot of images of products that I developed throughout my career at Pelican. And yeah, if you guys have any questions or thoughts, comments, how do I get a job in the video game industry? Happy to help if I can. And yeah, I hope this was fun to watch.